This episode is supported by our patrons: Julie Gray, Bree Ames Smith, Robin Brown, Janelise Cannon, Jamie Lang, Maria Sanchez, Valerie Jacobson, Jill Harrigan, Chantel Oliver, Heather McKinnon, Michaela Frew, and Caitlin McTaggart. Thank you so much for being our sponsors. We couldn't do it without you. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, Katie.
Today, our story begins in a wintry barn at a farm in what's now Poland. January 1945.
Ooh.
It's World War II.
Yeah.
Tanks from the Soviet Red Army are rolling into the snowy farmyard immediately after yet another harrowing, inhuman battle. There's a German couple who is operating the farm after its Jewish owners were deported. The Soviet soldiers kill them, butcher them, and feed them to the hogs.
Ooh. Well, that ended better than I thought that sentence was going to end.
Oh.
So, feed them to the soldiers.
Hogs. They're going to eat the hogs in the morning.
Ah.
But what these Red Army soldiers don't realize is that an American paratrooper from the 101st Airborne, more famously known as the Band of Brothers, is hiding in the hayloft. This is Joseph Byerly, better known as Jumpin' Joe, who was the first paratrooper to land in France on D-Day.
Wow.
He blew up a power station. He was captured by the Germans, sent to a POW camp, which he escaped 3 times. And he's been starving and freezing his way across the Polish countryside. He's hiding in the hayloft. A biography based on Jumpin' Joe's oral history was published years later, so let's let Jumpin' Joe take it from here.
That night, I stayed in the loft and got down in the hay. It was colder and hungrier than ever, but knew that night would be my last as a fugitive. In the morning, I watched them carefully to pick up the right man to approach. That would be the senior NCO, whose first order of the day was to slaughter the hogs. I couldn't help but check if there were any parts of the 2 Germans left, just the bones picked clean. They cooked up the hogs. I didn't want to disturb them during chow. When they were finished, I took out my last pack of cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, pretty wet, and came out of the barn with my hands up. "Amerikanski tovarzysz! American comrade!" I yelled. I walked toward them, keeping a big, friendly smile on my face. Someone told me that it must have been like E.T. meeting Martians. Nobody knew what was happening. I'd counted 5 Russians. 2 of them raised their weapons. The others, including the NCO, just stared at me. I repeated, "Amerikanski tovarzysz," and then the NCO gestured for me to be frisked. I had the Luckies in my left glove as a welcoming present, but they didn't notice, and I was allowed to put my hands down. I extended my right hand, the NCO decided to shake it, and then all the Russians started talking. They examined my GI coat, and the American Eagle buttons seemed to convince them that I was who I said I was. So I wasted no time and motioned eating with an imaginary spoon. They gave me 1 bowl and then another, and I curled up in a warm corner and slept. Every time I woke, there was someone staring, but I wasn't going to rush it. I waited for the commanding officer to come around. The next day, I met the CO. A stocky, weather-beaten officer who had the complete respect of her troops. I didn't realize she was a woman at first. She had a name 5 syllables long, so I just called her Major. She announced that I was to go to headquarters for processing. She opened her arms, looked at me hard, hugged me harder, then said, "Proshaj, tovarzysz." "Goodbye, comrade. You must leave for the rear." She had a translator, so I asked him what was going on. Well, she thought some American POWs had been liberated back in eastern Poland, so I would join them. But I'm not a liberated POW. I said, "I'm an escaped POW. So what?" "So I want to stay with this outfit." "You do? Why?" "To fight the Nazis. Fight them with you." When Major understood that I was volunteering to serve in her battalion, she broke out the vodka.
Wow. What a story.
Yeah.
This is Tank Commander Aleksandra Samusenko, the only female tank commander in the 1st Guards Tank Army of the Soviet Red Army.
Awesome.
This woman's military career was constructed entirely during the unprecedented death and destruction of World War II. And her story is almost the polar opposite of the war stories that dominate our narratives in the West, because, like, we've got Band of Brothers. We've got Jumpin' Joe liberating the world from fascism while their sweethearts are waiting anxiously for them back home. The Soviets have Aleksandra Samusenko and a gender and race-blind communist party liberating the world from capitalism. I think only when we see all sides of a story can we begin to understand what happened and why. So today, we are going to see World War II from the Soviet perspective, perched atop a T-34 tank, commanded by Aleksandra Samusenko. And what's amazing is Jumpin' Joe Byerly is our primary source about her. It's
Wow.
because she absorbed this American into her unit, he recorded the story when the Soviets didn't.
Yeah.
Her story is bonkers. The Soviets didn't record it, and we'll find out why. That's an interesting element, but she survived commanding tanks in, among many, many other things, the largest armored battle in the history of the world. Have you heard of the Battle of Kursk?
No. And, like, that statement is astounding.
Yeah, like nobody in the West has heard of it. It's so relevant today, especially because right now there is war in Kursk as Ukraine is pushing back into Russian territory. It's history spinning back on itself right now.
Wow.
What was it like to be a woman in the Soviet army during the biggest war in the history of the world? You could not make this stuff up. I'm Katie Nelson.
And I'm Olivia Mickle.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
Our guide today is public historian Hayley Noble, author of the website and Substack and social media accounts called Soviet Women in Combat.
Yes, my name is Hayley Noble. I'm the executive director of a local historical society.
Hayley Noble lives in Moscow, Idaho.
Yes, I study Soviet women, and here I am living in a Moscow. In grad school for my thesis, I studied Soviet women in combat on the Eastern Front, and I still like to research and share about these amazing women.
I was reliably informed that army units and organizational structures couldn't succeed and couldn't function if you allow women in, that it would immediately tank the whole the whole structure.
Fascinating you should say that, because
In grad school, I kept reading about these women in combat, more and more information, and more fascinated. So we're talking 2018, 2019. An announcement was just made in 2018 at the time that they were going to open combat roles to women. And there were all these questions, will they impact combat and unit cohesiveness? Are they even capable? Can they do it? And so for my thesis project, I was able to use the Soviet example to show, guys, it's already been done and it was successful. And so within that larger research, Samusenko was one of these women that I read about. She was in a position of leadership. She was very respected. She was a fierce leader.
Яблони и груши, зашумели ветры над рекой, проходила передом Катюша, в сапогах пилотки боевой.
her childhood is something of a mystery. Even her city of birth is contested.
She was born in 1922, either in Chita or the Zlobin district. There's not much about her early life.
According to Russian state history, the mystery is her own doing because her father was arrested and either sent to Siberia or killed for rebelling against the Soviet regime. So if she was born in Chita, that's in Siberia, and it was common for political exiles' wives and families to follow them to
That's
Siberia.
what I was going to ask. Is this in the gulags?
Yep, she could have been born in a prison. Very Bubulina type vibes.
Wow.
But unlike Bubulina, who was born in the prison in Istanbul and took up her father's banner, Aleksandra, if she was born in the gulag, she did the opposite. No, Dad, you were wrong. And as soon as she's 18, possibly before she's 18, she enlists in the Red Army.
So she actually started her military career in the Red Army in Finland, fighting in the Winter War.
The Winter War.
Ooh.
Have you heard of it?
Yep.
Kind of a huge deal in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe and largely ignored by the West.
In the early days, Finland was part of Sweden, but Tsarist Russia conquered and annexed that area that is now Finland and made it a grand duchy. In 1917, after the collapse of the Russian Empire, Finland declared its independence, as some of those other conquered territories did. And the Soviet Union recognized it. They said, okay, yes, you can have your own sovereignty, that's fine. But then as Stalin rose to power and the Soviet Union was expanding and gaining power, they really wanted to regain that territory that was lost during the revolution. And so when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, and the Finns actually put up a bigger fight than the Soviets were expecting.
Horrific.
Horrific. Yes. Preparing for this episode was immensely disturbing. I've seen photo collections from the Winter War that are now been all digitized. Nightmarish scenes of human violence where the dead are frozen solid in their moment of terror.
Yeah.
And imagining her, an 18-year-old woman, integrated into the army, like it's not gender-divided units or anything. She's just one of the foot soldiers. She's the bottom of the barrel. Witnessing such horror, it's hard to imagine. The Finns used white camouflage to hide in the snow. The Soviet army had these dark uniforms, extremely easy to spot. The Finns were using these guerrilla tactics. They're famed for their snipers. The Soviet army, you can hear them coming from miles away. They've got tanks, they're noisy, there's nowhere to hide. And the Soviet soldiers had been told that they were helping to liberate Finland from capitalism. So they're like, we're here to save you. And when they got there, they meet such extreme resistance. They were like, this is shocking.
You're supposed to welcome us with a parade.
Yeah, doesn't that sound familiar? Ukraine.
Iraq. Afghanistan.
Every
American intervention in the last 100 years.
So, Aleksandra, she's one of the Soviet invaders. She's experiencing this extremely terrifying frozen hellscape. And also, at the same time, the disillusionment of setting off to join the army of the good guys.
Right.
And you discover that these people aren't welcoming you at all.
She's a foot soldier. She's a private. She's a grunt. And she's doing the hard labor. She's marching days on end, carrying a rifle. Really a basic infantry soldier, which really shows how tough she is.
Here's just one factoid from the Winter War. The Soviets bombed Helsinki to smithereens when they realized that they couldn't just roll in with their tanks. And when the West was like, hey, stop that. You can't just bomb Finland. The Soviet commander, Molotov, he said, we're dropping food and supplies for the starving Finns. We're not dropping bombs. The Finnish resistance fighters invented a very effective DIY bomb made of gasoline and tar.
Called a Molotov cocktail.
Molotov cocktail.
Wow.
They called it that because they were saying, this is the drink to go with the food that Molotov is dropping. And they made them in like glass drink bottles.
Yeah.
And strapped them to their belts. And they would just walk around with them strapped to their belts whenever they needed a bomb, and they hurl it at a tank.
The Soviet Union tried to conquer all of Finland, and they really ended up with just bits and pieces that was ceded to them in March of 1940. And Hitler saw, the Red Army, they're not that good. They couldn't even conquer Finland. And so that really planted the seeds for later the German invasion of the Soviet Union.
Now, this part of the story can be, and often is, told as this sort of measuring of wits between Hitler and Stalin. Who is more of a military mastermind, or even who is capable of being even more brutal. And that is one part of the story. But if you zoom in on any individual soldier, Germany or the USSR, what are they fighting for? How do they see the world? Do they even know anything about global politics, or are they 18 years old and signing up for adventure, going out there to get the job that they can get?
Yeah.
The German invasion of the Soviet Union began on June 22nd, 1941. And when your homeland is invaded, that's kind of a big deal and a big rallying cry. And so at first, the Soviet Union said, well, I don't know if we need women at this point, because women did volunteer and were turned away. But by the time you get into August, September, October, things are much more dire than they were in June. And by that point, they said, yes, we need all the bodies we can get.
If you join the Soviet Army, do you even know that Stalin has a catastrophic lack of resources?
They didn't even have enough weaponry or uniforms. They didn't have female uniforms. So there are these stories of women like stuffing boots with newspaper and, cinching pants up to their armpits. And, you're standing there next to somebody with a rifle. You don't have one, and you're waiting for that person to die so you can pick up their rifles.
Do you know, as an 18-year-old soldier, that Stalin has this willingness to send as many millions of bodies as it takes to die by German bullets? Do you know what you're signing up for?
They needed anybody they could get just because it was really brutal. And they needed the manpower, woman power. You do see all female units. A lot of people know about like the aviators, the night witches, which Stalin created with Marina Raskova. But a lot of the other units were integrated as far as the infantry and the armored units. There was no segregation. So it was really such a spectrum of experiences, depending on where you were stationed, the unit you were with. I mean, like anything else, there's so many different stories you hear.
Aleksandra knows being a foot soldier is not the dream life. Now what is she going to do?
She decides she wants to go to tank school, where she learned to operate and work on a T-34 tank, which is a medium-sized tank. And she was assigned to the 1st Guards Tank Army, was able to rise through the ranks. By the end of her life, she's a captain. So that tells you a little bit about her work ethic, her leadership abilities, that she is able to be an effective leader and be somebody that her unit respects and is willing and able to follow into battle. And, she gets some commendations as well.
What does it take as a woman to achieve this? Because this is such an interesting time. The Soviet Union is sending out all this propaganda. Gender is irrelevant, comrade. Race is irrelevant, comrade. The only thing that matters is class. So if you are being harassed at home, try joining communism. Try coming over here where we don't care about your skin color or your gender. People left America by the thousands. And this is something we never learn in American history. So what is it like to actually live out that narrative? It's one thing for the man to be saying, there is no gender, there is no color. It's another thing when you are interacting with all of your fellow comrades.
Yes, initially, it was very much, we are a socialist society, everyone is equal, but it was still a very patriarchal society. So the messaging can be one thing, but the implementation can be something different, where it was still very much femininity equals weakness, masculinity equals strength. You still see all of those very typical patriarchal ideologies at work, but the official messaging from the state was very much, we need you for the war effort, come protect the motherland. Some women who volunteered for service were accepted, and it's like, great, yes, thanks for coming. And then you had the other ones who had to apply multiple times because they were being turned away. So I think it depended on where you were, who was manning the table that day, all of those kinds of random factors. And of course, also what you look like. If you're a little petite, teeny tiny woman, they're going to say no, versus, a larger person who is maybe more accustomed to manual labor. They could say, yes, we'll find a use for you. So there are all of those things at play.
What was it like for her? We have like the tiniest little bits of paper trail to follow. One letter, right after she gets promoted to commanding the tanks, in one letter from her superior officer, it seems like he needs to confirm to somebody like, yep, she actually has been promoted to this position. And in that letter, he says, yes, she is actually in charge and she will stay in charge so long as the boys don't fight over her. Which I think is so interesting. Yeah. He's like, yep, she's perfectly capable. She's in charge. The only problem I foresee is if some of the soldiers fall in love with her.
The classic, as long as you're not a distraction.
Yeah.
As these women were deployed to the front, there was propaganda that said, look, our women, they're doing such a good job. They're so effective. But at the same time, they're dropping pamphlets on the Germans that say, look at you guys, you got beat by a girl. You should feel so ashamed. This little girl is beating you. So it was such double talk.
And what about being a tank commander heading into the largest battle in the history of the world? What was that like? What even is going on in your head?
Well, I guess you don't know it's how bad it's about to be.
Hopefully you have no idea.
How many is it?
It lasted a month. Basically, there's a piece of the Soviet Union that is a salient. It's sticking out. It's sort of sticking into German territory. And so Hitler targets that. It's easy to pinch off because he's already surrounded it on three sides. He's going to pinch that off and he's going to claim it for Germany. He rolls in from the north and the south in order to take this region. He's got Nazi technology. They've got the Tiger tanks, which are like the Mercedes of tanks. And she is commanding a little squadron of T-34 tanks, which I guess the best way to summarize the T-34 is like good enough. It's a good enough tank.
It's the largest tank battle ever in history. It's one of the biggest land battles in military history. It was a big deal, and it was really seen as a turning point in the war. This was July and August of 1943, and at this point, the Germans had steamrolled across the Soviet Union and were really gaining momentum and getting closer and closer to the heart of Russia. And this was a stopping point. The Soviet Union, they were able to stop these troops here, and part of that is because at the same time the Allies had begun their invasion of Sicily. So Germany, some of their reserve troops that were in France at the time, Hitler had to send to Sicily and Italy. That means the Soviet Union, they were able to stop them here at the Battle of Kursk. And this was the last strategic offensive that Germany launched in the Eastern Front. After this, the Soviet Union was able to repel them and start pushing back. So this is really seen as a turning point in the war and a change of that momentum.
I mean, this battle was a hellscape beyond our capacity to even imagine. The numbers are truly staggering. Literally miles of devastation.
She was a part of that she took part in that battle that is the deadliest and largest tank battle in history. and that she survived that battle. Like, that's just amazing.
Apparently, she had this terrifying war cry that she would use to rally her men.
Wow.
As a tank captain, she would have been in charge of multiple tanks. So she's got radios, she's coordinating how these tanks are moving. And so she really had to have a big picture view of what was going on.
The numbers in the end, it depends if you believe the official numbers of the Soviet Union, and it was in their interest to make their numbers as small as possible. But the casualties in this battle equate to about 2 million people in a single battle dying over this small piece of land in Kursk.
She survives that battle.
She must have escaped at least one burning tank, because later on she's described as having burn scars and like plenty of harrowing wounds. She went through hell. Almost literally went through hell.
At one point, her unit was tasked with a counterattack of 3 enemy tanks, 1 T-34 versus 3 Tiger tanks. That's an uneven match, but she was able to dispatch all 3 of them. They fought for hours. And for the bravery that she showed, she was awarded the Order of the Red Star in July of 1943. So it's difficult to really track her career through the war. You just kind of get these snapshots almost.
And the next snapshot we have is courtesy of the paratrooper of the 101st Airborne, Jumpin' Joe. She's commanding the unit of tanks that is pushing into Poland, and they find him in that barn.
So Joseph Byerly, as I said, he was part of the 101st Airborne, which are a pretty big deal in American U.S. military history. So think like Band of Brothers. He would have been a paratrooper. The night before D-Day, he's in his plane, and they're over France, and they hit some turbulence, they get some flak, and they have to bail out, and he gets captured by the Germans. And so for 7-8 months, he's in various POW camps. He escaped with 2 other guys, and they are shot during their escape, and he's the sole survivor of that escape. He's hiding out in a farmhouse, and the Soviets decide to, camp out at that farmhouse. That's what he wanted, though. He wanted to run into the Russians because he knew that, common enemy, that's the best case scenario. He knew a little bit of Russian because there were Russian POWs at his camp. And so he comes out with his hands up, American comrade, and they, of course, they're initially suspicious, as you would be. And then the commanding officer comes into camp, and of course, he said at first he didn't even realize that she was a woman because you're all bundled up, and, if you've got a hat on and stuff, you can't even tell. And it wasn't until his second encounter that he's like, oh.
Major asked, what should I be called now that I was in her outfit? Just by my first name, I answered, easy to remember because it was the same as Stalin's. Her troop thought that was a good sign, and canteen cups were bashed all around. From then on, I was known as Iyo, short for Joseph. The vodka was so strong it made my nose run. Major ordered attention and announced that if Iyo was now a fellow soldier, what kind should he be? She really knew which buttons to push. The tank drivers said I should be a driver, of course, because the tanks were made in Michigan. The gunners shouted, no, an American should shoot American shells. The recon sergeants shouted louder that I should be a scout, because I had already been behind Hitlerite lines. A scout is what I wanted to be, what I thought I'd do best. I knew something about the terrain to the west and what the Hitlerites had there. Not much, from what I'd seen. I started off as an infantryman on Major's tank. That was okay. I'd be a few feet from the CO, and a battalion commander usually doesn't get killed. Now I wanted a weapon and asked for a Tommy gun like the one I jumped into Normandy with. There were plenty of Lend-Lease Tommy guns in Major's battalion, but no one wanted to give his up. So I was armed with a PPSH-41, the Russian submachine gun they'd used on the farm couple. It held 70 slugs in a drum. With some grenades to stuff into my overcoat pockets, I was ready to get back into the war.
So for about a month, he served alongside them.
Yo and Aleksandra Samusenko's unit were pushing toward Oder, O-D-E-R, is a city and a river that was basically the gateway to taking Berlin. The population of the city before Nazi occupation had been in the hundreds of thousands or maybe millions. And now it's down to a few thousand. It was a hellscape in itself. At least 12,000 Soviet citizens were just allowed to starve to death after the Nazis occupied the city. They're headed there to liberate it.
Snipers were the main problem as resistance began to wilt. Instead of a morale lift, my comrades became gloomy because a river was ahead, the Oder. So what? I said. We haven't fought a single tank. That's because the tanks are on the other side, Eel. That's the way the Hitlerites always fight. They confided that rivers were sumps, trenches for Russian blood that must be filled before crossing. Between slugs of vodka, they spoke of the Desna, the Dnieper, the Bresina, and the Vistula. No soldier in the battalion now had survived them all, but the rivers were legacies, the equivalent of 4 Normandies. Now ahead lay the Oder, the last river. The Hitlerites were concentrated to defend it. Their last stand before Berlin. Drinking was harder when Major got her orders to move up to cross. As we were moving up, a recon squadron was pulling back from the Oder. A squadron at full strength would have about 700 troops and 100 vehicles. We had priority on the road, so when they made way for us, I got an idea of how many were left. Less than 100 guys and 10 shot-up scout cars. Major found their commander to ask him about the situation on the river. The senior man left in the squadron was a 20-year-old lieutenant. He was in deep shell shock. 88s had blown every one of his amphibious vehicles out of the water with their crews. He put his head on Major's shoulder. She stroked it like a mother and crooned him in a soft voice. At times, the Russians were very open with emotions like that. She gave him 2 bottles of vodka before he climbed off our tank. Major called her regimental commander to report what she'd learned from the lieutenant. The colonel had told her to take anyone she needed from the recon squadron, even though he didn't command it. Major said she didn't want anybody. The survivors were too shaken. They would lower her battalion's morale.
He describes her as just this fierce woman. But you also see these instances where she could be very tender, too. I really like seeing those different scenes because oftentimes we have this idea that to be a warrior, you have to be tough and hard all the time. And we see that that's not the case, that you can be sensitive and emotional. In these situations, you really need that sometimes. And we see that with some of the other women I researched as well, that they could have this effect on men who were processing trauma, that they could be a comfort in a sisterly or a motherly way, that it wasn't romantic at all, but a comfort in a time that was needed. Again, it's this cognitive dissonance where we see femininity as a weakness, but in these times where it's really needed, it's a strength to be able to have that emotional intelligence to comfort somebody when they need it. Some of the other accounts I've read, it's these women, they're trying to retain their femininity in this harsh, male-dominated world. They're trying, they're putting flowers in their hair. They're thinking of a time when they could wear dresses and, listen to music and dance like before the war happened. And we see with these Soviet women that you can be a girly girl and still be a badass warrior.
The weather was our worst enemy. Not a lot of snow, but very, very cold, below zero, and the wind felt like being sandblasted with ice. The doctors today consider my feet frostbitten, though I have all my toes. I know they're still with me, because they still become very painful at times. We all wore layers of cotton and wrapping strips of burlap around our brogans. Everyone's antifreeze was vodka. We were pushing the Germans back, and that's all that mattered. Because I was sometimes close to the radio, I could tell that the Major's commander didn't often call and never chewed out for advancing too slowly. One time the battalion on our left got ahead of us by a couple of miles and asked for her to protect their flank. She said relax, we'd gone far enough for the day.
The amazing thing is they liberated the POW camp that he was at.
So it was on the 31st of January that my battalion fired on the column of POWs. I begged Major to head in their direction, and she was more than willing. The terrain began to look familiar. Pretty soon we came upon the railroad tracks from Breslau. I told her there would be a stone road pretty soon leading up to the Stalag. She decided to approach it from the woods. The Russians were pumped up when they learned that this time they would hit a fixed position where the Hitlerites could not just fire some artillery and fade away. Oh, they started yelling as they went through the woods. Then the scouts were held up by barbed wire. They'd reached the outer fence of 3C. Major's tanks were now jammed on the stone road. She asked me if the road led into the camp. I said, yes, right to the main gate. Follow my ass, she replied. I had to scramble back into the tank as Major roared off in the lead. 4 tanks back, I made the same turn where I had been dumped out of the beat barrel a month ago. The main gate was down. 3 tanks were churning around the center, machine gunning every building. Their treads were full of barbed wire from crashing through the gate and fence. Other tanks were using their cannons to knock down the watchtowers.
This would be an amazing movie. So they liberate the camp. He, ran over and got to see some of the Americans that he was captured with. So he got to see some of his friends. They find some explosives, and there's a safe in the commander's office, and so he's able to blow that open. And he finds, his own paperwork from being a POW. And there's, money and other valuables.
I only cared about the records. The Russians poured in to grab the watches, jewelry, and cameras that had once belonged to the POWs. And money. Reichsmarks, rubles, Swiss francs, greenback dollars were blowing around. Major grabbed my head, pulled it back, and planted a big wet kiss on my lips. Hoo-ah! Her first sergeant agreed. She ordered the money shoved into a big mail satchel before the commissar could intervene. Then she radioed the regimental commander, said that the situation at Stalag 3C was under control, so her battalion was ready for its next mission. That's the spirit, the colonel said, and gave her one move on to Kustrin at once. We pulled out before I could say goodbye to the Americans, pulled out on a Major's tank where about $200,000 in various bills took the place of several cannon rounds. Russian troops took over and began evacuating the American POWs east. They ended up in Odessa, as I eventually did.
And in our next snapshot, they're moving toward Berlin. Jumpin' Joe wakes up in a ditch. Their tank has been attacked.
I heard a high whine. A flight of Stukas dove out of the rising sun. I saw the bombs grow larger. That was the last thing I saw, or remembered for a while. I woke up in a ditch with the medic bending over me. Major was staring, with her hands on her hips. The medic was packing my wound with snow. I'd been hit in the knee too, but I didn't know because the groin was so painful. When the medic turned back my coat, blood gushed out and Major shielded her eyes. I thought, my God, she must have seen much worse than this, or I'm about to die. I was probably in shock. From what I remember, most was the shock of seeing her make such a scene over me. She bent down and said, "Go home to your family. The war will soon be over. Proshai, tovarish." I managed to salute, but she was jogging back to her tank. In the turret, she turned back to look at me before yelling her war cry. It sounded different. Her eyes were full of tears. Our time together had been so brief, but like no other I had ever heard of. She felt it, I felt it. We stared at each other as we both realized it. Of all the people who may have survived World War II, I wish I knew if she was still alive. I'd go to Russia just to see her. My major, my CO, who was a woman.
He was shipped to a hospital in Odessa and eventually back to the US. He never found out if she lived or not.
He talks about he tried to do research and find out if she survived the war, but he was never able to figure it out.
He never knew, but we know now.
The next entry in our story is that she dies a short time later. So they liberate his POW camp in January of 1945. In February is when he's wounded and sent home. And then on March 3rd is when she dies. But there are conflicting accounts of how she dies. One account says that in the dark she was crushed under her own tank. Another one says that she was crushed by a German self-propelled artillery vehicle. Another is that same story, but just her legs were crushed, and then the Germans captured her, and they interrogated her, tortured her, and when she didn't give up any information, they then shot her. The last one is that she died from a direct hit in her tank, but that she managed to get out and succumbed from her wounds. So it's hard to say which one is the true account of how she died. Like, those are wildly different stories. Most of the stuff that I read seemed to think that it was more plausible that she was crushed by her own tank, that she was kneeling behind one of the tracks, and in a firefight, the driver of the tank didn't know she was there.
I mean, it's what happened to Gerda Taro, was run over by a runaway tank from her own side.
You're right. Yeah, when you're in the tank, you can't see what's behind you. You can't see anything.
And if the tank operator gets killed or injured, it just keeps driving.
Yeah. And if the tank operator gets drunk.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's buried in Poland in Labs, and she was posthumously awarded the Order of the Patriotic War.
So does she overlap at all with Janina Mellberg?
The counterfeit countess.
Like Poland? Does she liberate the city, the camp?
Liberate the camp, right. I looked into this because she's right in that part of the world. Majdanek was liberated in July. Samusenko died in March. So her tank unit is a part of the larger Soviet initiative called the Vistula Oder Offensive, and that's where they are pushing to Berlin. That's the goal. Get to Berlin, and that's the end for the Nazis. So it's this really long front that's hundreds of miles. And Aleksandra Samusenko, she's on the northern side of it. Looking into the history of this initiative, it was hugely successful. There was almost no German pushback except in the north. And in the north, the fighting was still so brutal. And that is what wounded Jumpin' Joe Byerly, and eventually what killed Aleksandra Samusenko. In the end, the Soviets kept pushing. They pushed all the way through. They took Berlin. It was a huge victory. And over the course of this initiative, this is when the Soviets liberated Auschwitz,
Wow.
Stutthof, Ravensbrück, Majdanek, all the most infamous concentration camps. So they were part of the casualties of this massive offensive that eventually was successful in ending the war.
Wow.
But what if she had survived? What kind of a world would she have gone home to?
I think as Americans, we don't always understand the scope of just how drastic the Soviet losses were. They lost so many people. Like we just, as a country, the US, we cannot fathom the losses that they sustained.
Just to begin to have some context, let's look at the numbers from World War II. The National World War II Museum has compiled the best statistics we can get. We can never really know for sure, but just to put the Soviet experience of World War II into context, let me just give you some of the numbers. Let's look at just military deaths. For example, you have Finland, 95,000 military deaths. Germany, 5,533,000 people dying in World War II. That's a high number. Poland, 240,000. The United Kingdom, 383,000. The United States, 416,800. Romania, 300,000. Okay, so that's our baseline. Even in China, which was extremely catastrophic, 3 to 4 million. Okay, then we turn to the Soviet Union. Military deaths, 8,800,000 is the low number. The upper end, 10,700,000 people. When you look at civilian deaths, in addition to the military deaths, 24 million people died in World War II.
Most of them were 18, 20, 23. It's a whole generation. For a lot of people, the brutality and the devastation on the Eastern Front is something that we can never fathom.
But what makes it even worse?
Even the women that did make it home, they went home and were shamed for their service because society didn't understand what they did. They called them army whores and rifle sluts. Other Russian women thought they were at the front to be prostitutes. That's part of the reason people didn't talk about their service for so long. It's because they were shamed for it.
How does that happen?
I know. You all saw it. This was house-to-house fighting. The Battle of Kursk wasn't just a tank battle. It was people defending their streets.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a social decision. They know that that's not true, but
incredible. Yeah, so why?
It must somehow be more convenient psychologically. Are they going, I don't remember, are they pulling back to patriarchy, like landing back again in women should stay home?
Yeah, but why? Because you won the war that way. You defeated the Nazis that way. I would have thought that would be the thing to celebrate.
And we won the war, and now we can go back to the way things should be.
Oh, the good old Karakuni, when you're desperate, you call on women.
Yeah.
And then you blame them.
And then you blame
afterwards.
them for having answered the call.
Their service was invisible for years. They didn't say anything. And it wasn't until the 80s and the 90s that they started talking about it. It's not until these later generations where they finally felt comfortable enough to talk about it. Or, your grandma dies and you find these medals and you're like, what? Which is why I just love talking about them, because the whole point is to raise awareness and normalize seeing women in these roles. you can be feminine and allowed to show emotions and still be a powerful, badass woman. And I think that is something that she really shows. I'm still doing the work because it's important to me, and I love it.
Starting from their attack across the Oder, 250,000 Russians died to take Berlin. So now I'd like to salute and say, Proshai, tovarish. You took it to the end, more than anyone else. You won the war.
Давай закурим, товарищи мой. Давай закурим, товарищи мой.
Special thanks to Hayley Noble for bringing us the story of Aleksandra Samusenko. If you want to learn more about Soviet women in combat, we've got all the links for you. Check the show notes or What'sHerNamePodcast.com for Hayley Noble's Substack, Facebook, Instagram, website, and monthly newsletter. We have a book list for you for further reading, as well as links to the Soviet music that we used for this episode. Thanks to Maria Volkanova, born and raised in the Soviet Union, for consulting on the music. Joseph Byerly was voiced by James Henderson, and his biography can also be found in our book list. Additional songs were composed by Exra Lipp, Amulets, Jimena Contreras, Wayne Jones, Esther Abrami, Quincas Moreira, and Daniel Foster Smith. Our intern is Katie Boucher. Thank you so much for donating, and thanks for listening.